Have you ever made a decision and then, looking back, you just think to yourself, what was I thinking? Maybe you held on to a losing stock way too long, or you couldn't bring yourself to sell something for what it was obviously worth. Well, today we're going to dive into why those seemingly irrational choices aren't random at all. We're going to unlock the secret logic behind your decisions and reveal a much more realistic and frankly fascinating model of how your mind actually works.
So let's just start with that big question. When you're making a choice, what to invest in, what car to buy, anything really, do you think you're being totally logical? For a very long time, economists were pretty sure you were. The classic model was something called expected utility theory, and it's built on this really clean, simple idea that we're all rational agents. We're supposed to look at all our options, coldly calculate the probabilities, and then just pick the one that gives us the most satisfaction, or utility. Basically, it imagined us all as having a perfect supercomputer in our heads.
Now, for this whole theory to hold up, this perfect rational agent has to play by some pretty strict rules. Their preferences have to be consistent and complete. But let's zero in on one rule in particular, called the independence axiom. All it says is that if you prefer, say, an apple over a banana, throwing an orange into the mix as a third option shouldn't suddenly make you prefer the banana. It sounds pretty straightforward, right? Well, let's put that to the test.
Okay, imagine this first choice. Gamble A is a sure thing. You get $5 million guaranteed. Done. Gamble B is a little spicier. There's an 89% chance you get that same $5 million, a 10% chance you get a whopping $15 million, but there's that tiny 1% chance you walk away with zero. So what's your pick? The safe bet or the risky play? Go ahead, lock in your answer.
All right, ready for round two? Now you have to choose between Gamble C, which is an 11% shot at $5 million, and Gamble D, which is a slightly lower 10% shot, but for that much bigger prize of $15 million. In both cases, the odds of winning are pretty low. So what do you do now, C or D?
So let me guess. If you're like the vast majority of people who've ever seen this puzzle, you probably chose A in the first round. You took the guaranteed money. And you chose D in the second round, figuring since both were long shots, you might as well go for the bigger prize.
And here's the punchline. If you chose A and D, your decision, while feeling perfectly natural, is considered logically inconsistent. You just broke the independence rule. Here's the tricky part. Gambles C and D are just gambles A and B with a common factor, an 89% chance of winning something, mathematically stripped away from both. A pure rational calculator would see that as irrelevant noise and stick with its original preference, but you didn't. Your preference flipped. So what on earth is going on in our brain?
This is where a groundbreaking idea called prospect theory comes in. It basically throws out that old model of a perfect calculator and replaces it with a picture that looks a lot more like a real human. The most critical shift is this. Prospect theory says we don't think in terms of our absolute final state of wealth. We think in terms of gains and losses relative to where we are right now. Prospect theory is really built on three huge psychological ideas. First, everything is judged from a reference point. Winning $50 feels way different if you're broke versus if you're a billionaire. Second, we have diminishing sensitivity. The emotional buzz of going from $0 to $10 is way bigger than going from $1,000 to $1,010. And third, and this is the absolute game changer, loss aversion.
This one simple phrase is the key to everything. Losses loom larger than gains. What it means is that the pain of losing something is a much more powerful motivator than the pleasure of gaining that exact same thing. And this one insight explains, well, pretty much everything. Let's make it super simple. Imagine finding a $20 bill on the street. That feels pretty good, right? Let's call that a +10 on the happiness scale. But now imagine reaching into your pocket and realizing you lost a $20 bill. Ugh, that feeling is awful. The emotional hit is just way stronger, maybe like a -20. It's the same $20, but the psychological impact is totally lopsided. And hey, this isn't just a gut feeling, they've measured it. Study after study has shown that, psychologically, losses hit us about twice as hard as an equivalent gain feels good. This simple 2-to-1 ratio is a kind of secret key that unlocks so much of our seemingly bizarre behavior, starting with how we value the stuff we already own. So how does this play out in the real world? Well, you ever try to sell something you own, like a concert ticket or an old bike, and you just feel like people are lowballing you, that they just don't get what it's really worth? That feeling has a name. It's called the Endowment Effect. A famous experiment illustrates this perfectly. They gave a bunch of students a simple coffee mug, making them the sellers. Another group got nothing. They were the buyers. The buyers, who saw getting a mug as a gain, were willing to pay, on average, about $2.75. But the sellers, who had to lose their mug, demanded more than $5 for the exact same thing. That's loss aversion right there. The pain of giving it up literally made the mug feel almost twice as valuable in their minds.
This exact same mental glitch also shows up in a massive way in financial markets. It's called the Disposition Effect, and it's this weird, all-too-human tendency for investors to sell their winning stocks way too early, but hold on to their losing stocks for way, way too long.
And prospect theory explains this perfectly. When one of your stocks is up, you're in the gains domain. Our brain gets cautious and risk-averse here. So we sell, we lock in that definite win. But when a stock is down, we're deep in the painful losses domain. And here, our brains do the opposite. We become risk-seeking. We hold on, we gamble, we hope it'll come back, anything to avoid the pain of actually admitting and realizing that loss.
Okay, so we've seen how this one little quirk, loss aversion, can get us into trouble with everything from coffee mugs to our entire life savings. Which leads to a really cool question. If our irrationality isn't just random chaos, if it's actually predictable, can we use that predictability to our advantage? Can we actually design systems to outsmart our own brains? Well, the answer is a definite yes.
One of the most elegant tools for doing this is something called a commitment device. It's basically a clever way to tie your own hands. You make a choice right now that restricts what your future self is allowed to do, making it much harder for that future you to give in to a temptation.
A fantastic study from the Philippines showed just how powerful this can be. Researchers offered smokers a deal. They could voluntarily put the money they'd normally spend on cigarettes into a special savings account for 6 months. At the end of the 6 months, if they could pass a nicotine test, they got all their money back. But if they failed, all that money went straight to charity. They were making a bet against their future weak self.
And the results were stunning. The group that was offered this commitment contract was nearly 45% more likely to have successfully quit smoking a full year later. It worked because they had weaponized loss aversion against their own bad habit. They made the future pain of losing all that cash feel way more real and immediate than the fleeting pleasure of having a cigarette. So the big takeaway here isn't that our brains are broken, it's that we are predictably irrational. Our mental shortcuts, our biases, they all follow a pattern. And once you can see the pattern, you can start to work with it or even around it. So we'll leave you with this question. Now that you know the pattern, what's one irrational decision in your own life that you could outsmart today?